Fried Asian. I am Keith Chow. On the episode this month, we have a very special guest. She is a former stand-up comedian and currently a YA romance novelist. Her books include The Do-Over, Sunny Song Will Never Be Famous, The Perfect Escape, So We Meet Again, Loathe at First Sight, and the brand new book, The Christmas Clash. Please welcome to Southern Fried Asian, Suzanne Park.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be on today.
I'm excited to have you. You know, before we started recording, you mentioned you're a listener, so it's always cool to have someone who knows the pod a little bit.
Yes, and I've been telling friends, like, this is the exact intersectionality of, like, I found my people, because it's like Southern Fried Asian. I love chicken, Southern Fried Chicken. And it's just, growing up in the South has had such a huge impact on what I write. So I feel like, yeah, it's this moment where I have found you and my community, and it's like meant to be.
Absolutely. Well, I'm excited to talk to you. And yeah, you mentioned that a lot of your books are actually set in very recognizable suburban Southern America. So it's kind of cool that, you know, part of the reason we do this podcast is that, like, oftentimes the Asian American story or the Asian American experience is set in like Chinatown or not in, you know, Riverwood Mall in the suburbs, you know.
Yes.
So that's what I really appreciate about your work. But before we get to that, I did want to ask, and, you know, ask everyone as we start the podcast, is how did you and your family end up in Nashville, Tennessee?
When I ask my parents this question, and I do it every few years just to see if they change their story or there's any sort of new information revealed about how they ended up here and how they found each other, it always changes enough for me to think it's all fiction. Like, I actually have no idea how they ended up in the United States, how they met each other or why, but the closest, like, similarity in their stories is that my mom actually was an exchange student as a high school student. And she ended up getting some sort of scholarship from a community organization in Kansas and ended up, let's see, in high school, her senior year, coming over. And she was only 17. Mm-hmm. And I think there's one newspaper clipping from the local paper there of her coming off the plane, and it was like a big deal. And so we know her story because she's not much of a, I don't want to say fibber, but she's not much of a storyteller. But my dad, he is. And so what I can glean from his coming over is that he was in the master's program at Peabody College at Vanderbilt in Nashville, and he got his master's degree in education. We have verified that because we have seen a yearbook. So that is actually true. We also know that he met my mom somehow because my mom ended up coming to Tennessee for college at Maryville College near, I believe it's near Knoxville. And then somehow those two met up at some sort of like mixers for international students. And at that time, I think there's just not like enough international students at any one particular school. So they had to like kind of have a regional thing. Right. And they met there. And the other thing that I know to be true, because they both have confirmed it separately, is that they were stuck on a plane together to Korea one time. And my dad, who is a jokester, but also likes to talk to people a lot, he kept bothering her while she was trying to sleep. And he kept nagging her, saying, like, can you, will you go out with me? And she said, I will go out with you if you let me sleep. And that is also true. So I think that's all we know. Like, the rest, it's like sometimes they say, like, oh, we met, and, they just make up things that Sure. don't necessarily make sense. And those have stayed true over time, the test of time.
The nagging on the airplane, though.
That's That is true, because that one has stayed consistent.
Well, nothing if not a romantic, your dad.
Yes. Yeah, it's like almost a meet cute, but it's kind of like a meet hate. I don't know like what my dad was thinking, but it worked because they're married now.
Yeah, there you go.
And they've I think they celebrate. Yeah, they've celebrated many, many anniversaries since.
So your parents both came. Like, your mom went to high school here. Your dad, studied. But he studied education. So you're already subverting Asian stereotypes. It doesn't sound like your parents, although they're immigrants, not your typical kind of like, tiger parents. Or were they? Were they tiger parents?
Well, eventually they sort of fell into these roles where they probably ended up more tiger parenting than probably it originally thought. I do think that they were pioneers in some way, where they came over for education, basically. And then in the end, my dad ended up giving up his kind of career in education. He actually did a little dabbling in computer science, which is a whole other story. Someday I'll have to tell that story and write it about it, because he was like early computer science. And he was like, this is for the birds. This is going nowhere. He ended up like buying a grocery store. And like, then he fell into sort of the whole corner market, like Kim's Convenience almost life. So I actually grew up working at his store because it was very close to the school that I went to. And after school, he'd pick me up and I would help him bag groceries and stock the shelves and do homework in the back.
So there are some kind of like overlaps. So a lot of like the quote unquote typical Asian American experiences. I've spoken on the podcast. I grew up in my parents' restaurant, and there's always the free child labor that comes.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. He expanded in that he kind of changed the area in the back, so it wasn't just more and more rows of groceries. He converted it into a laundromat. And that
so it was the convenience store and the laundromat. So
it was a convenience store and a laundromat separated by milk crates. So it was very sophisticated and high end. We ended up kind of like, there was some synergy. Like they would buy the like snacks and stuff from the grocery store if they were waiting there. There was like, I became really good at playing Pac-Man and Miss Pac-Man because those were in the laundromat to keep people busy because we didn't really have a TV or anything in there. So I'm actually very good at those games, surprisingly.
That's pretty cool, growing up with some arcade cabinets in the back.
I have to say, and I'm kind of sad that those like were kind of given away when the store was sold, came with the store, because I would have loved to have those like in my house right now, especially during COVID. I would have been a master. Yeah, and then I became really good, and I still am very good at counting quarters. Like I can count quarters so fast, it's ridiculous. So there's things those life skills that are very important in life. Yeah, those are things I gleaned from working in the laundromat and the store.
Like you said, your dad studied education, so it's not like the typical. Even though he dabbled in computer science, it's not the typical like, you're going to become a writer, and that's you're not going to be a scientist or a lawyer or a doctor. Or was that was never the issue with you, right? Like they were completely proud of you being a writer, right? Is what I'm getting at.
They were, but I did do the pre-med route. there was that, and my brother is a lawyer.
Oh, okay.
He's a Harvard lawyer. So once he got in, we were like, okay, my sister and I, we're done. Like he won. We don't have to do anymore. He's carrying the family name onward and upward. I think they realize, because you're always surrounded, at least they we're surrounded by their Korean community, and there's always that keeping up with the Joneses equivalent, keeping up with the Parks, Kims, and Lees, right? So they were always trying to, break out of their lower middle class status and trying to reach higher. And so that, of course, that usually comes with trying to prep your kids for something bigger and better than what they have. My mom was a medical technician at a hospital, and my dad just was a self-made man of laundry, his laundry empire. And, the grocery store, that lasted a while. And then he ended up selling that to just manage an office complex because it was just easier and lower amount of hours that were needed to.
Right. The hard labor, not as necessary.
Yes.
So, you mentioned that you still had a Korean community that your family was a part of, but growing up in Nashville, what was it like as a Korean American? Nashville's not as, non-diverse as a lot of people may assume just because of the music that comes out of Nashville. but it is still a metropolitan area. What was it like for you growing up in the Nashville of your youth?
So we grew up in a suburb right outside of Nashville, probably about 30 minutes outside. And so it was kind of a smaller area in terms of it being a little bit more rural. And my zone school, elementary school, like a lot of people who come onto your podcast, they say, like I was the only Asian. So my brother was the only other Asian at my elementary school. And it's weird to see because they had this legacy of putting up all of their class photos of their fourth grade, graduating classes. And it's just a sea of basically non-Asians. So it was like it had a huge, actually a large African-American community, Black community, but also a white community, of course, but like just nobody else. Mm-hmm. And it was just funny to see all that and then just see my brother's picture and then my picture. And yeah, we were definitely feeling different because it wasn't necessarily, I wouldn't even say it's racism. It was just ignorance at that age.
Mhm.
The kids, some of them are mean, but a lot of them just didn't know. They would just ask questions because they just didn't know, like, why are your eyes like that? And why is your hair so dark? And it was honestly a lot of the time just curiosity
Mhm.
because it was so alien to them, right? Because it wasn't even on TV. You know,
Mhm.
you might see, Connie Chung, and you might see like the early makings of some of the Hollywood stars you see now, but it really wasn't a big thing then. And then I think just my neighborhood itself was also very white. I think the last population count was still like in the 20,000s when I had
Mhm.
left Nashville. So it wasn't very big population there. And then after, I think it was like elementary school, I ended up going to a magnet school. And I think that's where things changed because magnet schools draw in kids from all over the
Right.
metropolitan area. Metropolitan Nashville area specifically has a reasonably diverse mix of kids if you pull from everywhere,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
So that was the first time I actually went to school with anybody that was Asian, and that was fifth grade onward. And, just made friends that looked a little bit more like me.
Mhm. So was there ever any kind of like culture clash being around other Asians? Because I know that I've shared the story that like I was similarly grew up in a more rural part of Virginia, is where I'm from, where the only other Asians in school were my relatives, and it wasn't until I moved to a place where there were actually other Asians where I felt actually like, oh, it's actually different being around other people who look like me. Like I almost felt more alienated around other Asians. Like, was that the case for you, or did you kind of like, oh, these are my people?
In high school, not so much, only because there still weren't a lot of
Yeah.
Asians. So it was still so, I think my best friend in junior high was Korean, but she was like a pastor's kid, and like it was just a really nice kid. So it wasn't. And then once we got to high school, I made some other friends too. And it got a little bit more broader in terms of more Asians at the school. And I ended up just with a reasonably diverse friend group, but it really wasn't until college.
Mhm.
So I went to school in New York, and that's the first time I felt almost othered within my own Korean
Mhm.
population. I did what you're supposed to do as the Asian. You go I took Korean class. I ended up a language class, and I ended up being part of the KSA at my school. And it was even like one of the board member type people. And, I did all those things, but I still was like, wow, when you say Korean American or Korean Student Association, you actually mean Korean American Student Association of the coasts, right? It was like most of them were from LA or New York. Oh, I mean, really from New York, New
Right.
Jersey. And then you had maybe third place was sort of the Bay Area and Los Angeles, and then everywhere else kind
Right.
of pulled together. And that's the first time I was like, I really am very non-Korean when it came to comparing to what
Yeah.
other people were like, because my Korean language skills were not the best. And then being around just so much Korean culture all of a sudden, and then being in New York, having so much access to even like the Koreatown there and like,
Mhm.
just a subway right away, it was just a lot. And and again, a lot of my good friends I made are Korean, but they, I did find people that I could connect with, but I did feel very much like a fish out of water.
Yeah. Well, when you were in New York, and I've heard you tell this story before, you kind of stumbled into stand up when you were living in New York, right? That wasn't part of the grand plan for Suzanne Park. Is like, let me do stand up and get on BET and NBC and all this these different outlets to tell jokes on a stage. So how can you tell for our listeners the story of how you became a stand up comic while you were living in New York City, which is the place to be if you're going to be a stand up?
I mean, really, I think it was really just because it was easy access to stand up venues and the community there. But the original goal for me when I was graduating from college, I was like, okay, so this pre med thing didn't work out. I
You don't like
had
blood.
entered.
That kind of is
Yes. So
part of the problem if you're
that's
going
a
to be a
whole
doctor.
other story. Like I was actually at a pre-med track. I had even an internship at a hospital. So I was like, I set up for like this thing working out. And I walked into a freight elevator because we were a staff quote unquote, as an intern. I was supposed to not take the main elevator. I, walked right in with like my tray of food because I was carrying food for some reason. And I walked straight into a dead body because they were taking him to the morgue. And I literally like me colliding with my tray with my, little carton of milk and whatever, into this foot tag for a person. And I was freaked out. And that was the first time I was like, oh, this is actually the other part of being a doctor. And I don't think I could handle this.
Yeah.
So when I told my parents, like, no, that really freaked me out, they were like, you are weak. But it did stick with me.
Yeah.
So I think they understood like that actually was a fairly traumatic experience. So yeah, so the pre-med thing wasn't going to be in my future. So I had to find another career. So luckily out of college, I got a career at an ad agency. While I was there, I still wasn't thinking like creatively. I was fulfilled and knew that deep in my heart, I wanted to be a humor writer all along. But I didn't actually know what that looked like or meant, but I knew I wanted to write funny things, whatever that meant. And so I did a Google search or whatever was equivalent to Google at that time. And
Ask Jeeves.
And yeah, it was something like that. Who knows? Ask Jeeves. I asked Jeeves, what is Korean American writer, comedy writer? Hit enter, and the first thing that showed up was a comedian that was local to me. She was in New York metropolitan area. So I contacted her on her website and said, hey, I'd love to know more about you and like how you ended up writing humor, and I'd love to know anything about you. And she said, sure, just meet me, and she set up the time and date, and I met her like a week later, and we had drinks, and then I started asking her a bunch of questions about like how she ended up doing humor writing and like where she is now. And the questions were something like, so it says on your website that you write comedy or you write humor. And she said, yes, I'm a stand-up comic. I was like, oh, that's cool. So it also says you're a producer and you're a producer and a writer. And she said, yes, I produce my own shows and I'm a writer for my jokes. And I was like, wait, that's not what I was thinking. Well, I meant, but I guess my Google search was weak. So I said, well, that was great. Nice meeting you. And we were about to part ways. And she said, oh, do you want to just see me perform? And I said, sure. So I follow her to the comedy club across the street, and she does a 5-minute set. And it was the first time I'd ever seen a Korean American on stage other than I think Margaret Cho and Henry Cho at the time were always on like kind of network TV,
right.
But that was it. And seeing her on stage talking about how she had grown up in the Seattle Tacoma area as a Korean American and telling just stories about her growing up and, her reaction to her community and, just whatever racism to funny observational humor. The crowd was just eating it up. They loved it. And I had never seen anybody tell like stories about growing up Asian on stage. And that was the first time I thought to myself, I think I could do something like this until I figure out this whole humor writing thing. And then I ended up doing it for 10 years. I don't know how or why, but it just kept doing it. And then at some point, maybe it was exactly at the 10-year mark, I said, well, I wasn't actually supposed to do it this long. I was just trying to use this as a way to kind of hone my craft of writing humor and writing jokes and writing comedy. And then I would figure out the rest. And then I never did that because I think stand-up was taking a lot of my free time. So I ended up taking classes, and then that's how I sort of ended up stumbling into just writing prose. And then I took a memoir and personal essay class, and then I took a sitcom writing class and just was trying to figure out all these things. And it turns out these are things that I was not very good at. And then I sort of ended up where I am by process of elimination. So that's another way to do it, to figure out what you want to do in life.
Well, I mean, you have over half a dozen novels to your name, so I guess you did something right. I have a hard time writing a blog post, much less 6 novels. But I'm always fascinated about, the process or the craft of writing stand-up because, I think to the naked eye, people just think you're just on stage and you're kind of riffing. You know what I mean? I don't think people understand like all of that is scripted, like the timing and the punchline and the setup and all of that is mapped out. And I wonder, as someone who's had such an extensive career, and transition from that to like writing actual novels. Like, what is the craft of writing stand-up, and how did that, if it at all, because I mean your books are also very funny, how did that inform your novel writing?
That's a really good question. When I did comedy, it was never the quick quip and
Right.
punchline kind of exchange, these fast paced jokes that some people do. It was always some sort of anecdote and some sort of twist that you were not expecting to resolve, that kind of awkward tension that you knew was coming. And then that's sort of how I did my stand up on stage. And I remember one critic in the Seattle area had written something like that I was one of those comics that you have to, it was like, I, okay, so they described me as cerebral, but I mean, I don't know if I would describe myself. I think of my humor on stage at least as a little bit more absurdist, but like he had said, like she tells packly tight stories with a punchline and an ending that you need to know how it's set up before you to understand the resolution. So it wasn't a critique. It was more like it's not a typical way of doing stand up. And I remember thinking, he's right. I was always like a storyteller on stage with some sort of way to make people laugh nervously at the end, because it was either some sort of twist on some sort of stereotype flipped on its head, or it was some sort of thing that you think because I look a certain way or the type of person I am and how I grew up would be a thing. And then some sort of way to end it where people are like, oh, whoa, I was not expecting that, and then laugh because it was like worth the wait. I think that translated pretty well. There are comics though who have a rehearsed routine, and I was just never one of those who had it so down to the very second of delivery that
Mhm.
there were people that I remember, especially when they were on the circuits, where they were just trying to master their 5 minute set so that if they would ever go on late night TV, they would be 100% polished and it would be ready to go. And that's really what how things are, or still probably are. And so there were comics that would go up there that, and again, we all kind of knew each other, where you would just have memorized somebody else's set because it was so predictable, because they were just trying to fine tune it
Mhm.
to make it perfect for 5 minutes. And it was funny because there would be somebody on stage and then there'd be people in the back like talking along with the
like
comic.
like TikTok before TikTok, right? Like that's
Yes. Yes, it was like stitching somebody's video and doing a duet where people are just saying the jokes because everybody knew the timing, everybody knew the joke, everybody knew the setup and punchline. And it was kind of funny because you would think that these guys were just riffing, but they actually were completely memorizing this exact thing down to the awkward pull of the shirt to the adjusting of like drinking water or whatever. It was all time. I was not that comic.
Mhm.
Sometimes I would change part of the setup or the punchline or something based on feedback from a previous performance, and then I would kind of iterate. And then how that affected my writing now, I think because they were always sort of mini stories on stage, I think it translated pretty nicely to something that you can read now in a book form. I did have trouble at the very beginning because when I was writing ideas for what would eventually be some of these books, I was always like writing down things that were either bits or like that would maybe turn into a scene, or it would be like a joke that could possibly be some part of a bigger thing, but it was never like the big idea. And once I was able to get like, what is this big overarching thing I want people to take away from this story? That's when it was like helpful, because then I could sort of easily write these scenes and move the story along, and then there'd be character arcs and story arcs, then it would all go in the right direction. But
Mhm.
it was like I was thinking very micro for a while, and now I'm able to think a little bit broader. But I do like translating some of the things that I've learned from comedy to what I write in book form, where a lot of it is beats, a lot of it is timing and reveals. I do keep those in the stories just to keep them interesting.
Yeah. Your first book is Loathe, right?
I had two come out in 2020, pretty close to each other. One was young adult called The Perfect Escape, and the other one was Loathe at First Sight. That was an adult book, and they came out within 4 months of each other.
Okay. Well, but either way, both came out in 2020. So I wanted to ask,
Yes.
what was it like to have, for anyone, I think anyone who's interested in writing, there is this, it's the Marty McFly moment where you get the box of books and everything, right? Like, what was that? Well, I guess that was George McFly, not Marty. Sorry, Back to the Future nerds. But like that's the moment a lot of people dream about, like getting your box of books and going out on tour and everything. Your books came out smack dab in the middle of a global pandemic in which the president of the United States blamed China and by association people who look like you. So what was that like, having your debut as a novelist happen in the middle of like one of the worst crises in global history?
That was not an easy time. There was good and bad that came out of it. I ended up doing a lot of virtual events. The good of it was new for everybody, so a lot of people were tuning in. It was bad in that it was new, and I was like dropping off, and there's like bad Wi-Fi, and like and nobody really knew what they were doing.
Right.
If you remember kind of the early days of 2020 and how people's backgrounds were, and like you didn't even know which programs to use. You use Zoom stuff most of the time, but there's Crowdcast that didn't work on certain browser. It was just a lot of chaos at that time. But I remember going in there thinking, I had everything planned for the debut in April of 2020, and it was early April too. So it was really particularly devastating when I had my launch event canceled, and I had an event in Seattle and I had to cancel that too. And, friends and family were like super excited because I hadn't seen them in a while, and they were going to come out for the events and the signings and things. And of course there were book festivals too that were also inviting me. And so it was a exciting time to be a debut, but then everything just like turned upside down, and it was just a strange time to be an author, because I think deep down you knew that it was like everybody understands what's happening to a debut author. So it's like, everyone's going to support as much as you can, but publishers know, like readers know, everybody knows what's going on. So it shouldn't like harm my career. But, as a non-white creator, you're thinking, would it though?
Right.
Like, would they use this to somehow be a reason for me not to be picked up later? Luckily that didn't happen, but that was always like in the back of my head, like I need to pound the pavement. I need to like get the word out any way I can, even if it's electronically and doing different things on social media, because I needed to show that I was like worth keeping around and my stories were important.
I think that's exactly right. When it comes to like when you're a person of color, you have to do twice the amount of work just to get half the credit. You know what I mean? So like so I totally understand that. And it's to that point, your books oftentimes feature Asian American protagonists, and that's had you become a debut writer 10 years ago instead of a stand-up, it probably would have been a lot more difficult to do a romantic comedy novel starring Asian American protagonists and have that be published, right? It would be like, oh no, I don't want to read that. We're thinking like the days before Crazy Rich Asians and Jenny Han and all that stuff, right? Like the idea of an Asian American romantic like the idea of Asian American romance is already like a step beyond for some people's imaginations,
Oh, for sure. And I think when I had graduated from college and again was thinking humor writing, the only books I remember seeing at the bookstore were Chang Rae Lee and Amy Tan. And
they were highly literature, right? It was Asian American literature, not like, romantic
Exactly.
comedy.
So it never even occurred to me in the slightest that I could write something fictional or non-fictional and it could be funny and it could be ever published, because it just was not even a connection I even made. And honestly, it wasn't until I saw David Sedaris's works where I knew he was gay that I was like, okay, so it's not the straight white, author that's being published. There's some flexibility there in publishing if you're not literary. And so like I didn't just jump to the fact that, hey, there are authors that are Asian, so I will be an Asian author. Like it just never entered my brain at all.
But you always knew you wanted to have Asian American protagonists, right? There was never a conversation where like, well, but what if he was white? Like, was that ever? Or I'm sure you had the conversations with some editors and publishers, right? You don't have to name names, but you can.
No, I think by the time I was writing and publishing, at least there were some contemporary commercial fiction that featured Asian protagonists. So it wasn't like, what is this? Like, I've never seen such a alien thing before in my life. I will say, so Perfect Escape was not my first book I had written. So the other things I tried to sell, I did get feedback that was, a little jarring. And you're like, do I read into this or not? Is this a microaggression or not? where some of them were, I've seen a story similar to this before. I don't think we need another story like, Bridget Jones, or like, Clueless, or whatever it is,
Mhm.
that was very iconically white, but never, featuring some sort of like, and I write workplace comedies in the adult space. So I was
Mhm.
like, so you're saying that because you've already have a 9 to 5, or you already have a, romantic comedy featuring, people at work and whatever, that it can't, it made me think that they were saying to me that there was not room because they already had their 1 or 2 stories that were
Right,
classics.
right.
And so that was a little bit harder because that was in 2016 and 2017. So it was still on the not early side, but it was still when things were changing and
Mhm.
starting to conversations were happening. And maybe me submitting is part of the conversation, but I was getting a lot of that at the time, where it was like, not, it's not you, it's just the market.
Right.
And there doesn't seem like we already have stories like yours, but and then I was like, yeah, but they weren't, we can't really give a rebuttal when they reject you. You have
You
to
could
be like,
try.
oh yeah, but mine are Asian, and my, there's other parts of her story that you haven't seen before. You can't do that. I'm glad there are more stories featuring Asian protagonists now, for
Mhm.
sure.
And I wanted to talk about particularly the new book that I think it's out already, right? The Christmas Clash
Yes,
just came
it just
out.
came out. Hmm.
And what I think is fascinating about it, and I have this, if you've listened to the podcast, I have this bugaboo about people who clown on, as I mentioned, I grew up in a Chinese American restaurant. And so I love the fact that this book is set in a food court,
Thank you.
like, and I think, I mean, I wanted to ask you, is someone, I think going back to your point about like meeting other Koreans, but they're from like LA and New York, they're the ones who don't necessarily appreciate like suburban mall food as much as like
Yes.
you and I may,
Right.
because that's, for what it's worth, that's what we had. That was our
Yeah.
access to quote unquote culture, like
Hmm.
when I hear Chinese American food is not authentic, I always wonder, like, then what is your definition of authentic? Because it's authentic to me. That's what my Chinese
Yes.
people were making it and feeding it to other Chinese people like me. So like clearly
Hmm.
there was some authenticity there. So let me just ask you about what was the catalyzing factor to set this particular story in the mall at a Chinese and Korean food court.
Well, first of all, I'm glad you appreciate this because I had so much fun writing about 2 rival food court restaurants, one Korean American, one Chinese American, and them just the owners and the families just hate each other because they're competing, right? They're in the same food court. And of course, somebody that's like a patron of a suburban mall kind of looks around and it's like, oh, these 2 Asian restaurants, I guess I'll pick one, And so when I decided to write this book that is the Christmas Clash, my editor had said before I even pitched anything, would you be interested in writing a holiday rom com? And I was like, hell yes, I'd write a holiday rom com because I haven't seen any Asian Americans in anything like that, something seasonal and fun. So sure. And then my brain immediately went to what was the holidays to me. And that was a close tie to my local mall.
Mhm.
So of course I Googled that and was like, okay, let me see what's going on with my mall growing up. And I found out that it was going to be sold to condo developers.
Mm.
And I was super sad because I was thinking like, wow, that whole building will be gone. And so I felt like I had to write the story about my old mall. So it's loosely inspired by the mall, a little bit probably more modern in the story. But
Mm.
so I wrote that book to pay homage to sort of this dying mall culture. And then when I turned in the book, right before I turned it in, I Google again, like just because I was checking the spelling of how to spell the area. And I found out that some local regional developer saved it and is actually, keeping the mall as is and just changing some, a lot of structural things about it. And so I was like super relieved. But how I even came up with the idea of the mall was just because it was, to me, was so tightly connected to the holidays for me
Mhm.
because it was just like a thing you did all year round, but especially around the holidays when the mall gets all decked out and fake snow and they play the holiday music. It just felt like the right connection and the right thing I wanted to write about. And as you know, I like writing about non-coastal Asian Americans, so I felt like this was a perfect way to tie in that sort of subculture with something that a lot of people are still very familiar with, which is suburban mall culture around the holidays. Why did I do dueling food court businesses is, aside from the fact that we had a very like kind of typical like corner market plus laundromat, we had friends that had different businesses that were, also kind of typical in that it was dry cleaners and restaurant owners. And we had a friend that worked at this restaurant that I loved. And it was a Chinese restaurant near Vanderbilt University. It's no longer there, but we went there all the time because it was one of my mom's really good friends. And so we ended up eating there maybe at least once a week. And so a lot of the dishes or the things that I remember, and because we're close friends, like they just let me run amok. So I was like in the kitchen, I was like eating all their dinner mints, like those little, like, those, those pastel colored dinner mints, the butter mints.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I love those.
Yeah. Oh, those are the best. Those little ones in the little glass little bowl with a little spoon. Oh yeah, that's like the best. And fortune cookies. I got my fill of those, and just I felt like very connected to her business, and so I think she had similar challenges. And at the time, I think my mom was selling insurance, so I think she sold her some sort of insurance. So my mom, it was kind of a client, also a friend, and our families got along, and so I was there. And I ate off their menu like every week, and I just had my favorites. It was like the triple delight was my favorite, and I've never found any place that makes it the same way.
Right.
So I it's definitely her own special thing.
Yeah, and then nothing ever beats the nostalgia of the food you grew up on, which is something I'll get to in a minute, as we tend to do with this podcast. But before we get to that, I did want to also ask, as you mentioned, you kind of write for two audiences. You have your like YA romantic comedies, and you have your more adult oriented. And I was just wondering, like, what is the like main difference in the way you approach, other than the setting may be more like office for the adult romance, and something less obvious like a mall for the YA stuff.
Right.
What's this? But is there actual difference? Because what I've found, especially in my advanced age, is that the audiences who actually read YA novels aren't usually like YA. Like, so a lot of times they're also like fellow 40-year-olds who are reading YA novels. So is there a particular like approach that you switch, other than like the ages of the characters?
I do like the fact that young adult is read by both people of our generation and also the youth of today, because I've always felt, and comes back to picture books and chapter books. When I had a daughter, was reading her stories, is because of the way early reading is set up, it has to be enjoyable for the parent and the kid, right? Because if you read a story and you don't really like the story, it's very clear to the kid, right? Because you're reading it and you know that. But if you really like the story, you get into it and you really like to like do the voices, and then you know what, you do a little flair, and you change it up. You do special things. So I've always felt that if I was writing to a kid audience and I knew adult readers were reading it, I wanted to make sure I gave nods to both, right? And so maybe one day if I ever write a picture book or a chapter book, I would probably have the same idea there, where I'm thinking like, I still want to make sure that the people who are reading it that are older will get something from it. But the main differences that I've been able to kind of come up with that I think really are true as I write more is making sure that the voice is right, that it is accurately reflecting somebody that is a true young person. Sometimes I read things and they feel older or they feel too young, and I really try to work hard at making sure that the voice is age appropriate. And then I also try to stay away from certain slang and from pop culture too much, because I think that's what people think of when they think of younger voices, and then they try to add in things and kind of go overboard. And teens can smell that, and tweens too can smell that from a mile away, like non-authentic representation, right? So I definitely am very careful about making sure I don't try to do that to make it sound like, oh, the youth of today will appreciate this nod. I don't do that. The other thing is just making sure that the perspective and the point of view is appropriate for the life experience of the person living it. So I do allow a ton of like room for growth and mistakes, because I think a lot of people get frustrated with young adult books. It's like, oh, this person is making this bad decision. And I'm like, how many bad decisions did you make as a 16, 17, 18-year-old? Like, I've made so many.
Right.
And to not allow to have this sort of like otherworldly knowledge where they just know what to do, it's like that seems unreasonable to ask for. So I definitely let my protagonist kind of go through a lot to get to the right place they need to be. And I think that's important,
Yeah.
just as a life journey and sort of like figuring it out on their own, because I don't think kids like to be told like this is how you do it and be didactic about it. They need to see it on their own. And I've had a lot of teenagers write me and say, here's what I learned from your book.
Oh,
And it's 100% right, like exactly what I was trying to secretly do.
yeah.
But they got there on their own and in their own words. And
You didn't have to
some
print the
people,
moral of the story at the end.
yes, yes. And it's never exactly the same, and that's by design. Like
Yeah.
I have different things I'm trying to do with every book that I do on a few different levels or layers or whatever. And I love it when people let me know what they thought and like, did you mean to do this thing? Yes, I did. Thank you for noticing that thing.
I mean, I'm with you. Like, I think sometimes that I can't stand the critique when you see it, but and I think maybe it's because it's the internet too, right? But like when you have the kind of nitpicky, like, well, this choice, I wouldn't have made that choice, or like that was such a dumb decision. And it's like, the whole point of drama is conflict. If you were like, I wouldn't have made those choices, then there's no story. You know what I mean?
Right. I mean, if you watch like Law and Order, if the people just solve the crime right away with no mistakes, and there's like no, like, I know here's the answer. And, like, what is that? Like, nobody wants to watch that.
Right.
So it's sort of the same like idea where you have to have this discovery process.
Yeah.
And I feel like I try to do that in all of my books, have this sort of moments of self-discovery, because I think people are always growing all the time and learning, and hopefully growing and learning all the time. I did get one review, just somebody sent to me just because it was funny. It was not the greatest review, but it was definitely somebody that was like, I know I'm not your target market, but this book sounded too teenagey. It was like teenage hyphen Y. And I was like, I don't know. I don't know how to take that, because I think that's actually what I'm trying to do, but also thank you.
Yeah.
Like I
always love that. I know I'm not the intended market. Then I think that's when you shut up, right?
right. It's like, why? And then why would you respond to that? Like that's your review for a YA book.
Yeah.
So I did appreciate reading that one, because it was pretty much like a summary of all how I see all reviews in my head that are not quite, you're not the right market. And here's why. Too teenagey. Well, that's
you're almost being redundant there, dude. It's if you only wrote this to middle-aged white men, and I'm not trying to say that's who wrote the review, but anyway, when we get to the end of the podcast, the one thing I ask all of my guests, because we are Asian and we are Southern, and food means the most to both Southerners and Asianers. You already talked about the Chinese restaurant you grew up in with the food you ate, but are there other food memories that bring you back to the outskirts of Nashville growing up, that no matter where you are, if you're in LA, you're in Seattle, or you're in New York, the thought or the smell, the faint memory of this particular dish brings you back home?
There is. My mom doesn't make it anymore, maybe because it's not as healthy anymore, but my mom does this funny thing where she is an experimental cook. My mom's an amazing chef cook. She just knows how to, when she eats something, she can figure out what's in it. And then actually has to figure out the levels of spice and the amounts and quantities. So she's got this talent. And so because she came over to the States when she was so young, like she was 17, she didn't really have the same kind of cuisine and background as most people. She had a fusion type of mentality almost, because she had very American food as she was growing up in the United States. And when she'd go back, she would have Korean food, but it was always like, she was always like more American in a lot of ways. And so her sensibilities were kind of like creating fusion almost within our household. So one of the things that I remember is one of the best memories is she worked in a hospital, and she, when you work there for like 30 years, you make friends with everybody, from the doctors to the nurses to the janitors, whoever, she just knows everybody. She's like the Korean mayor of Vanderbilt Hospital. So she made friends with the people at the cafeteria because they, she saw them every day and she ate there every day. And one day they made fried chicken. And okay, I love fried chicken. As I think we talked about this before the podcast even started. I love fried chicken. And my mom, we bought fried chicken or whatever, but she never made it. And then she was like, this is the best fried chicken I've ever had. And she was grilling the person who is behind the counter, like, how did you make this? And my mom basically recreated that recipe by asking, like, how did you make this fried chicken so it's so crispy, and also just like the flavors are so, it's like perfect. And so she went home and she just like iterated on this recipe for like months, trying to get it like exactly like not like restaurant, but it was like just like the cafeteria food fried chicken and at the hospital. So it's like even weird, right? So we ended up, she perfected it. And she was always telling me how good this chicken was. And I was like, that seems weird, Mom. But sure enough, when it was ready, she handed it to us, and it was seriously the best fried chicken. It was like crispy, and the flavors were just so complex, but also like she just knew what to do, right? She asked the person and they gave the best guesstimate, and then she had to figure it out. And I still to this day, it's the best fried chicken I've ever had. And it's funny to know that now Koreans are doing fried chicken, and it's very like common now, but back then it wasn't. It was like Southern, it was considered just like a Southern thing. And sometimes like if you went to Korea, you would go to like Kentucky Fried Chicken and they would have like fried chicken with kimchi or something, but it was just never the crispy kind of chicken like the way she made it. And it was because this woman who had worked in the cafeteria forever, she told her her family recipe, and my mom decided like that's going to be our recipe now. And made it. And I was just like impressed because she just has this ability to figure the stuff out. It's like, with a gift.
Yeah. No, that sounds delicious, actually.
Now I want crispy fried chicken all the time. And because she doesn't make it, she's like, it's unhealthy, I can't deep fry it, put it in the deep fryer. I was like, oh, why? It was so good. Yeah.
And then as you mentioned, the irony now that like Korean fried chicken is such a popular dish.
Yeah, she's like the Korean Colonel Sanders now. Like she could have had this franchise.
I know, right?
We could have been booming.
You were Bonchon before Bonchon.
It's true.
Anyway, Suzanne, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. How can people find you and your work on the internet?
They can find me on my newly revamped website. I just went through a website overhaul at SuzannePark.com. And I'm most active on Instagram. A lot of it's book content. There's a lot of hamsters on there too, for some reason, and a lot of food. There's a lot of food on my pictures as well. Yeah. That's at Suzanne Park. And Twitter, I've popped in and out, so you can see some funny things there. Also Suzanne Park. Facebook, not as active, but I do occasionally post there when I have something urgent to say, and that's at Suzanne Park Comedy. And I couldn't get rid of my comedian pass, so I had to like change that website. So it's like comedy and writing. So it's kind of this weird mishmash of things.
Yeah. And The Christmas Clash is now available in bookstores everywhere. Suzanne Park, thank you so much for being on Southern Fried Asian.
Thank you so much for having me, Keith. It was a lot of fun to chat with you.
Awesome. Thanks so much. You can follow me on Twitter at @TheRealChow, _real_Chow, and on Instagram at RealKeithChow. Follow the podcast at Southern Fried Asians on Instagram and at Southern Asians on Twitter. Subscribe and download on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, anywhere you get podcasts. Find it all at hardknockmedia.com/Southern Fried Asian. As always, the podcast has been co-produced by Jess Vu. And until next time, keep it Southern Fried, y'all.